We'll get started in just about 1 minute. For those of you just joining, this is Michelle Savage with XBRL US. Our webinar will begin in just a couple of minutes. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. This is Michelle Savage again with XBRL US. You're here for the XBRL US webinar, IFRS Taxonomy Deep Dive 2, the SEC Notice and Taxonomy Review for XBRL providers and data users. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Just a couple of logistical points. We are taking questions, although we've received a lot from our audience already. But if you do have a question, please click on the Q&A link at the top of your screen, and you'll be able to key in your question, and we'll receive it and take them in the order received. Also, if you have any difficulties with technical issues during the webinar, please email us at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online. For those of you who are getting CPE credit for this event, please make sure that you respond to the CPE questions as they appear on the screen. We'll be doing CPE questions at 2 points during the session, and we'll walk you through that as well. Everyone on the call, with the exception of our speakers, is on mute, and I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have with us Jill Davis, Associate Chief Accountant, Division of Corporation Finance in the Office of the Chief Accountant at the Securities Exchange Commission. We also have Walter Hampshire, Senior IT Program Manager in the Office of Structured Disclosure, also at the SEC. And we have Campbell Pride, President and CEO of XBRL US. Before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to ask Walter and Jill if they have some disclosure requirements that they'd like to mention. Walter?
Yes, indeed. And this is a disclaimer that applies to both Jill and myself. The Securities and Exchange Commission, as a matter of policy, disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views expressed herein are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or of the author's colleagues upon the staff of the Commission.
Great. Thanks very much, Walter. Okay, so moving on, here's our agenda today. We're first going to have a demonstration of the IFRS Taxonomy by Campbell Pride. Then Walter is going to give us a demonstration of an IFRS instance document. We'll have a couple of CPE questions, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A, most of which we've received from you, our audience. We'll follow up with some final CPE questions, and then we have references for both SEC and IASB listed at the end of the program. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first section, which is the IFRS Taxonomy demonstration. And I am now going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Campbell Pride, who's going to walk us through a demo of the taxonomy.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. So if you see my screen here, I can make this a little bit bigger. What this is just a view of the IFRS taxonomy. This is probably something that you're familiar with, viewing the US GAAP taxonomy, if you've used the US GAAP taxonomy. But this is just a view of the IFRS taxonomy. And one of the things I wanted to do just for 5 minutes or so is just walk you through some of the things that we'll be talking about today relative to the questions that we've received. So when you hear the questions, you'll have a bit better context if you're not familiar with the issue of what they mean. So as you can see, this is the IFRS taxonomy here. You can see my mouse. You can see it's got a sequence number, and then it's got the different sections. Similar to the US GAAP taxonomy, it has statement, and then it has something called notes, whereas in the US GAAP taxonomy, I think that's called disclosure. Make that a bit bigger. And you can see here's I brought up the US GAAP taxonomy at the same time, so you can see some of the slightly different statements. The same. It's called a disclosure. They have square brackets around it. So this is back to the IFRS taxonomy. A couple of things that people have commented on, which is just worth noting. You can see here disclosure of employee benefits as an example. We've got text block. These are lowercase in the IFRS taxonomy, uppercase in the US GAAP taxonomy. Same with abstracts. All of the basic policy or framework that's been followed with IFRS is to make these lowercase. The other thing that I'm just looking at property, plant, and equipment as an example. There's a lot of tables as in the IFRS taxonomy as well. In the US GAAP taxonomy, you'll see it called a table text block. But here in the IFRS taxonomy, they don't have this term of the table text block. So you'll see things like text block throughout. And Walter will address this and how you deal with this later in the discussion today. The other thing that's worth noting and people have asked questions about is just you can see here we've got a table or called an XBRL hypercube. But this table has line items associated with, you can see they're siblings of each other. Whereas in the US GAAP taxonomy table, the line items are children to the table. So I'll just show you this here. So you can see here's a table, here's some axes, and then the line items are children to it. So that's another difference you may notice. And Walter's going to talk about that in a minute and go into more detail on what that means relative to filing. So that's what's happening when you see this stuff. The other thing that is they're the main differences, or some of the differences. Some of the other differences you will see is in the US GAAP taxonomy, the duration item type is being used. This is when you want to measure some time. Like, for example, you want to say what's the expected life of some property, plant, and equipment, for example. Here we have useful life. In the IFRS taxonomy, they've been referred to as either as string item types, and in some cases, things like share types have been referred to as decimals, and that's a question that Walter will talk about a little bit later as well. One thing to notice, just an interesting difference here is just there are some differences in how things are structured between IFRS and US GAAP for the same concepts. This is an example where we've got property, plant, and equipment. You'll see if you look through this, there's no element for accumulated depreciation. That's been modeled as members. So you can see here, here's the property, plant, and equipment, all the different types, which is the same as US GAAP. But you will also see in here they've got the carrying amount, the gross carrying amount, and the accumulated depreciation associated with it. So you just use the property, plant, and equipment line item. You use the gross for the gross amount with the gross member, the accumulated depreciation member to represent the accumulated depreciation, and then property, plant, and equipment with no dimensions is net of any accumulated depreciation. So that's another difference that everyone's probably going to walk into. So I just want to make sure that you're clear of that. Anyway, that's kind of some of the differences with the IFRS taxonomy, and we'll go through those in a lot more detail when we get to the questions section. So Michelle, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Campbell. Okay, so I'm going to take over sharing my screen in a minute here. Campbell, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Sure. One moment, please.
Okay, so we've just seen the demonstration of the taxonomy, and now we're going to move to Walter Hampshire, who's going to give us a demonstration of an XBRL instance document. So Walter, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you can pick up and...
Yes, hello everyone. So today, the instance document that you're going to see here is not terribly different than the one you would have seen about a month ago. And the reason for that is that we wanted to focus on the actual questions that you had. So this will be a relatively quick tour of the same instance document. If we look at this airline, we will see that the structure of the presentation groups is going to be this as it's specified in the filing manual. In other words, you'll have the statements, and they are identified by the fact that the word state appears. Although our rendering engine today, if you were to go use our production previewer, is not going to show you this statement of equity in this way, it will soon, and certainly by the time you are ready to file. So the fact that the IFRS taxonomy uses a different axis and different member names for what you see here along the top line, that will be accommodated in the rendering engine soon. So don't worry, we're not trying to change the way you render things. It's just something that hasn't been deployed into production yet. Similarly with cash flows, you wouldn't expect that to look any different. And once again, with the notes, here we have a selection of a couple of them. If we look at the accounting policies, you'll see that, yes, indeed, there is one presentation group, and each of the different chunks of text that refer to each different policy has been broken up into a separate text block. So just taking one at random here, we have the description of the entity's accounting policy for subsidiaries. And there we are, there's the description of the accounting policy, right? So their naming convention for the element is a little different, but if you were to go into the taxonomy, as Campbell showed you, you will find that, structurally, it's going to give you the list of accounting policies in pretty much the same way that the US GAAP one does, even though the naming conventions are a little different. There are notes tables. And here's a case where I picked this one deliberately to illustrate that, yes, we do understand that if there is no table text block in the IFRS taxonomy, the right approach is not to go reach over into the US GAAP taxonomy to use its element. And that is not actually the right approach. The right approach, believe it or not, is actually to create your own custom table text block. And the reason for that really has to do with the very somewhat unusual role of our table text blocks in the rule, in the rendering engine, and so on, because their function is basically to duplicate and give a presentation of the original. There's not nearly as much, let's say, semantic weight, if you will, on exactly what the name is and the label. You still need to provide some documentation if you need to do it, and so on. But it's not like making up some new line item on your face financials. It just doesn't carry the same significance. So the right answer, no, do not go into the US GAAP taxonomy just to create just to find a standard table text block. Go ahead and create your own if you're in the IFRS world. And finally here in this sample instance, which is not yet posted, it will be soon enough. And you will see that, well, here's our details, right? So there were some numbers in here. It turns out that, like with all of our details, you need to tag all the amounts that appear, and you need to pay particular attention to any amounts that actually are mentioned in the disclosure requirements of the relevant IFRS standard. So if, for example, the thing says you are supposed to report your average number of employees, and that's a number in there, then by golly, that's going to be in there. In our cash and cash equivalents, you may remember from the previous presentation that I created a custom axis for currency. That probably didn't make the greatest example, but what it did raise was the point about the fact that we are working with FASB to take certain portions of the FASB taxonomy, which are either part of rules that are SEC rules that are not necessary, that may be based on GAAP but are not GAAP, and certain axes and members and other things that really are not specific to US GAAP at all. One of my favorite examples, of course, being like the list of airplanes, right? The list of airplane types. Well, that is not GAAP. It never has been. It's always been kind of an inside joke that those things were in the US GAAP taxonomy rather than being either in some separate taxonomy about airplanes or in a DEI taxonomy or something. But they're clearly not, FASB does not control the list of names of aircraft. All right, so we are in fact trying to split those things out, and you'll get a lot more detail about that very soon. And as normally with the SEC, we can't exactly tell you when. But the currency axis that was used in the earlier example happens to be one that we are pretty sure is going to be put into some generic taxonomy that will work for both IFRS and for US GAAP. So looking forward to that. That explains that question. And here we have just one of the interesting bits of this example is that the original filing from which we took this had something called overnight. Well, what the heck is overnight? Well, there's nothing called overnight in the IFRS taxonomy, but there is something which is sort of sounds like it, but it turns out not to be. So once again, this is a sample in which you will see certain places where, yes, you really do have the right to create extensions if you've basically done a good job of doing your best to find the right element in the IFRS taxonomy or in some common taxonomy that is part of the SEC suite of taxonomies. If you want to actually see the instance itself, here I've opened it up in our instance, the Fujitsu instance creator, and eventually, I suppose, sometime after I click on this button, it is actually going to come up. Oh, look, there it is. And once again, nothing very exotic here. There's just, structurally not a lot that's very different when you come to actually tagging the instance. Okay. What Campbell was showing you was differences in the way the taxonomy may be organized or differences in naming convention. But once you get down to looking at what's actually in the instance, it all should be very familiar to anybody who actually has to go do that tagging, who's ever done a US GAAP taxonomy. So so while the standards may be different at some level, you very quickly get to a very common level of conventions that just aren't all that different. Okay, that is my instance document presentation. Merely to point out also, you can tell from the fact that there is in fact an inline version of what I just showed you. You can infer from that correctly that if you want to file an inline filing using IFRS, that's okay too. And we're going to be publishing this. And once again, I don't know why my computer is so slow, but you can indeed file an inline filing with IFRS. And there it goes. All right. So here we have, and you can use this as a sample of like how to get this effect where you have like the form and the fiscal year and so on. You can use this as an example of how to use inline XBRL to get these kinds of effects. Here's how you get, the yes checks box to turn into the well-known seasoned issuer tag. Here's how, if you want to use the tag that says we are using the IFRS reporting standard, you can do that too. That's optional, but you can do that. Right? And so once again, if you go through the entire example, you'll see no surprise here. The note numbers do not have to be tagged, the numbers do. And as we go down and get to the notes, this is a new version of the viewer, by the way, in which these orange bars on the left are a little shorter and things work a little faster. You'll see, once again, that absolutely no difference in the way you're going to tag things under inline between US GAAP and IFRS. Technically, there's just no difference at all. Okay, and let me go back to the this stop sharing, and so that Michelle can go back to the presentation slide.
Great, thanks very much, Walter. Okay, I'm sharing my screen again now, and we're going to move on to questions. So I'm going to turn it over to, we're going to start with CPE questions. I forgot about this. So for those of you who are getting CPE credit, please make sure that you respond to the polls as they appear. So our first poll question, which you should be seeing on the screen right now, is the SEC notice on the IFRS taxonomy indicates that foreign private issuers must submit their first filing, no later than their first Form 20F or 40F for the fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2017, or on or after December 15th, 2019, or on or after December 15th, 2020. So please respond to the poll, again, if you're getting CPE credit, and we'll give it a few more seconds for everyone to register their response. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in just about 5 seconds here. Okay, I think we're going to close out our poll now and go to our second poll question. How long is the public review period for the IFRS taxonomy? Is it usually 60 days, usually 30 days, or usually 120 days? So just register your response here. And with the CPE, typically you'll get your certificate in a week or two. Okay, I'm going to give it about another 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. All right, great. And now we're going to move on to some audience questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Campbell, who's going to moderate the Q&A portion. Campbell?
Thanks, Michelle. So the first question we have here is, that's what we talked about a little bit just before, why are line items not children of tables? And rather, I think we know this, we know their difference, it's just difference with IFRS, but maybe that's just to Walter, is just to elaborate on what is the impact for filing.
Okay. Well, you know, I've worked in Washington, D.C. for quite a while, and so I know so many different ways of answering a question and not answering it. But today I've decided to be nice and actually answer this question. And so if you'll go to the next slide, I will explain this. So first of all, that picture that you were looking at before was the presentation link base, okay? And what's actually important is the semantics of these facts and the axes. And so what you actually want to be looking at is the definition link base. And so I've got my own pictures here of the definition link base. And what you can see here is the H, right, which notes where the table is kind of positioned very much the same way, right? It's the first thing, it's the first child underneath the top level abstract element. And although there's a difference in the way it's named, right? So you got a line items at the top and you've got an abstract in the other. Functionally, they're the same. And here's why they're the same. They're the same because the semantics of the table is that if it is the child of an element, it's telling you that the axes of that table apply to all of the other children of its parent, right? So it's saying something about all of its siblings. So what really matters is what is the relationship, you know, the physical relationship, sibling, cousin, first cousin once removed, of the non-abstract elements. In the top line here, you see intangible assets with the indefinite useful life, right? That's a non-abstract element. What matters is that those things have a certain relationship to each other, and the intermediate number of abstracts where they're nesting really has no impact on the semantics. The same thing over in the US GAAP side, where you see that we have quite a few more non-abstract elements, right? So the, excluding goodwill and assets acquired, but structurally, they actually stay in the same relationship to the table and to its axes. Now, I am very well aware that there are tools for which the definition links are generated from the presentation. Okay, whether that's the right thing or not, different question, but I am aware that there are tools that do that. But the reason almost doesn't matter as to why one is above or below the other. The only important thing, really, is what's the structure that you see in the definition links. The presentation link base, if you go back for me, Campbell, one step, the presentation only governs the presentation in particular in Edgar. It only governs the presentation in the rendering engine. So the only thing that's going to matter there is not really the whether one is a sibling or the first cousin twice removed, or whether it's called a line item. Those things don't even appear. What does matter is what is the order in which you place the axes, right? How will those, in fact, therefore be nested in the presentation? What order did you put the line items in? And what order did you put the members in? That's the role of the presentation link base. And the presentation doesn't have anything to do with the semantics. Yes, I'm aware software does tie those two together in a lot of cases. But the fact that you see in the IFRS taxonomy that they have chosen to put the line items in one place rather than another and call something abstract really is just not nearly as important as the relationship between the table and its axes and the non-abstract facts, non-abstract items that are its siblings or descendants of its siblings. That's actually what really matters, the definition link base. Next slide, Campbell. Okay, and so that's just the same picture again, showing here's what actually matters. Okay, next slide. There you go. Campbell.
Okay, so the next question we've got relates to, and I didn't really point this out, but in the IFRS taxonomy, in the US GAAP we have domain members, whereas in the US GAAP taxonomy they call them members. And I think you kind of answered this a little bit, Walter, but maybe just clarify this for folks.
Sure. Why don't you go to the next slide for me? All right, so the important thing here, once again, is not what is the element called, it's in what relationship does it stand to the axis? Is it the dimension default or is it not? Now in the US GAAP taxonomy, they provide for you the dimension default. If I were pointing I'm sort of pointing my finger uselessly at the equity component domain part of that where it says dimension default. It doesn't really matter what the name of that element is there. It really doesn't. And the reason it doesn't matter is because that element, equity component domain, because it's the default, will never appear in your instance. It can't appear, actually, as a member. That's like one of the properties of dimensions. Now, in the IFRS taxonomy, they have not put in your dimension default arc because it's sort of obvious. It's like everywhere that they have a dimension domain would be the dimension default. So the original question is perhaps a little bit, I guess I'd have to say it's a bit of a surface question because you're only looking at the name and trying to infer something from it rather than looking at what you should look at, which is what's the structure and how does it stand in relation to the axis. And in that case, then it's easier to see why it would be confusing because you don't see any dimension default arcs, but they are implicitly there everywhere that you see a dimension domain. Just as a general comment, about the IFRS taxonomy, these are not problems with the IFRS taxonomy. The IFRS taxonomy has a much wider audience. Remember that the US GAAP taxonomy was built sort of for Edgar back in 2007, 2008, and it's not too surprising that there are some aspects of it for which, that might not work for every other country. Whereas in the case of the IFRS taxonomy, they kind of need to make minimal commitments and focus on the semantics because you don't really want to cause a regulator that happens to have some other infrastructure or terminology to be excluded or have a problem. So in fact, that's why you see kind of a minimal commitment approach in their design. So you just say, okay, well, here's the dimension domain. We mean for this thing to be the domain, but as far as exactly where and how and when you put the dimension default in, that's something you could do in some company extension or in some regulator specific extension. So that's just sort of the generic defensive. If you see something that is in IFRS that is in some way less constraining than US GAAP, it's very easy to understand why. It's because they've got a much wider audience to satisfy. Next slide.
Thanks, Walter. So the next question we've got, this is like a two-part question. It's a little bit detailed, but maybe we can just go through it. So basically, the first slide here is just basically showing a situation where we've got some acquisitions and we've got some elements, and they're asking why there are no total assets and total liabilities. So Michelle, if you go to the next slide, and they've broken this into two questions. So, so this is just showing where they report these total assets acquired and the total liabilities assumed. And so the question is, they've provided us with options, but when a filer goes beyond the requirements, the standard represents the total assets and liabilities, which option is most appropriate? Extend in line with other elements in the taxonomy section, for example, assets acquired, recognized acquisition date, or use element assets with the acquisition date context and apply business combination axes member. So that's the question that this person's asking.
If you go back to the previous slide, just the sort of the premise of the question, I kind of puzzled over the wording of that. There appears to be an interpretation on the application of elements within a disclosure. I wondered what that meant. And I think what they mean there is that even though in principle you should be able to take an element in isolation with its definition and use it, in principle wherever it is actually disclosed in a filing, I think this is some kind of implicit critique of the IFRS taxonomy, that somehow these elements that they're pointing at are dependent in some way on their parents or something. Well, I'm not sure I see that. I actually challenge the premise of the question. So I'm going to choose to ignore kind of that piece of this and just focus on the practical question, which is on the next slide, which is, what do you do when there are intermediate sums? Well, this is not a new question, right? This is not unique to IFRS. It certainly appears in the US GAAP taxonomy because you can't always anticipate every single intermediate node that you might see. And in fact, anybody who has been on the consumption side of XBRL knows very well that when you start inserting nodes into the middle of a hierarchy, particularly a calculation hierarchy, nobody's going to thank you for it. If you are using the element properly, and even if you've gotten it from someplace else and it's semantically correct, that's great. But the fact is that the IFRS taxonomy does not have these elements in it for this particular disclosure. Okay, so this is a genuine problem. It's not unique to IFRS. And what's interesting, I think, about the question that they've asked here is they've actually thought this through and said, okay, well, there's really two different ways to do this. One of which is just like throw in some extension elements and stick them right in the middle of your calculation tree and, consumers be damned. Okay, so that's one option. I suppose you can tell from that which one I favor. Option two says, look, you already have the standard elements necessary to semantically construct what these things actually mean. They are assets. They are part of an event, which is this business combination, and they are as of a certain date, and they are part of a particular company within an acquisition. And so therefore, you can actually represent this using dimensions without having to create any extensions other than the extension you're supposed to create, which is the extension that names the company that you actually acquired. So although I can never say, oh yeah, this is what you should do in all cases, the principles at work here are very obvious. You know, don't insert nodes into the middle of a calculation tree that are extensions. Okay, that's kind of a no-no. We all know that. Don't do that. And the other thing is, if you already can construct the semantic equivalent by using a combination of an element and an existing axis and member, then you're supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be using the common elements that way rather than just creating new elements. And the fact is, if you look at these other items, there's no reason why you can't take those line items and also dimensionalize them in exactly the same way as these intermediate nodes, the assets, the liabilities, so that they're not confused with the global values. They have to be qualified by which acquisition you're talking about anyway, because if you try to combine this with next year's filing, well, it obviously is not the same number. It may not be referring to the same business acquisition. So you already know that you're dimensionalizing this. So you just use the dimension that you already essentially have to do in order to tag the whole thing. Long answer, but that's the basic philosophy here. If you can do it by combining existing standard elements, that's always preferable to creating an extension, a custom element. Next slide.
Okay, thanks, Walter. So we've got a couple of questions on this next slide, and so we'll just go through these. And a lot of these relate to string item types. And the first question is mapping required for references to a string item type?
I think the rest of the text is actually the actual question. In other words,
yeah,
what mapping required.
Yeah, and so they give an example here where they've got obviously with the numbers and everything. So maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit.
Right. So the basic idea here is they're saying, okay, here's a string. You know, the description of the material leasing arrangement. Clearly, that's the entire chunk of text. And then when you get down to the level of detail tagging, then the future minimum lease commitments, where the annual payments, blah blah blah, right? That's actually a number, and they're saying, okay, well, there is no numeric tag that says that, right? It's only the text. Well, this is once again a pretty easy one. If there's really no element that is about future finance lease commitments, then that is something where you would actually need to extend the element. Do not try to put, just, numbers into things that are clearly supposed to be strings. That really doesn't help anybody. Nobody will thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Walter. So move to the next question, please, Michelle. So I've got a couple of questions here. The first one is the segment information note, which is disclosed under the face financials, and above the note one, required to be tagged, maybe as a parenthetical concept?
Okay, so this is an easy no. It's not parenthetical. It's actually not. The primary obligation of tagging is to correctly represent what the disclosure is. So by just saying, okay, well, it's under this and it's above that, there's a number of things which under IFRS could appear in that gap between those two things on the page, right? And we're not really in a position to give blanket advice about that. I will say, it's not a parenthetical. We all know that a parenthetical is just for those concepts that are appearing in the header of the line item, right? That's a kind of a funny curiosity that comes out of the limitations of the rendering engine, and that's all it is. So it's not that. But the question of, is it a note, or is it a different position for the note that isn't numbered? Is it actually a separate statement? Those are things for which you got to look at the actual fact pattern. And if you have a question about that, I think, as Jill is going to say later, sometimes the fact pattern is such that you really should just contact the FCC with that particular fact pattern, And if they can advise you, they will. And so consequently, this is a question which you just can't answer except by exclusion. It's not a parenthetical.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point you raised there, Walter. I think when you look at just this is Jill Davis. When you look at just the concepts and the requirements of Regulation ST with respect to providing interactive data, it's pretty clear, and I think it's Rule 405B talks about the content of what needs to be tagged. And it's clear that it's the financial statements, and the financial statements in their totality would be the face and the footnotes. So if somebody decides to either provide some footnote disclosure on the face of the financial statements for whatever reasons, or if there's, they want to have a schedule of segment, segment reporting or, results disclosed, financial information, just the location isn't necessarily going to dictate whether or not it has to be tagged. The presumption that if it's part of the financial statements and it's required for your compliance with IFRS, then I think the presumption would be that it has to be tagged under our rules. But we certainly would encourage you, as Walter said, to reach out and talk about your particular facts and circumstances, so we can make sure we truly understand what the circumstances are. But based on the question, we try to make a good guess. But I think this also kind of brings up another point. We have been getting some questions that we're reviewing internally with regard to entities that submit with their consolidated financial statements other sets of financial statements, and trying to determine which sets of those financial statements, if any, for the additional financial statements need to be tagged. We're still in the process of considering those questions, but we certainly do encourage you to come in and reach out to us, and early on, to give us time to analyze your situation, see how your particular fact pattern works with, or can be addressed via the existing rules, and then to the extent that we need to provide additional guidance, we certainly want to do that as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Thanks, Walter. So the next question we have here is, and this is what we mentioned earlier when we were looking at the IFRS taxonomy, is can you explain the IFRS approach on durational elements? And the SEC, well, the FASB taxonomy has numerous durational elements, but the IFRS is using decimal item types. Is there anything that filers should be aware in regards to this?
Well, I did a little research on that, and honestly, I kind of saw exactly one such element in the 2016 IFRS taxonomy. Maybe they're more in the 2017 or something like that. And the problem, of course, is if you're using a decimal to represent a duration, then you better hope that the element itself is telling you what unit of time it's in. Right? So in other words, if you have an element which is, say, number of days during which the minimum fell below such and such, that's telling you it's in days, and therefore it's an integer, and that's easy. But if it just says the period during which this, well, what does that mean? It could be weeks, could be anything. And the notion of trying to use decimals with a measure of time, the basic problem here is that that's just not the way that XBRL was, or XML itself was ever intending to use durations, right? You wanted to actually use the data type that's known to processors that are pulling these things into databases and so on. So at the end of the day, here's what's going on, right? If you're using the standard element from IFRS and it says decimal item types, well, you might as well stick to the standard element, right? And if you have, and you're going to need to specify what the unit of time is, nobody's really going to thank you for that. But if you have to extend, you absolutely should be following the EFM guidance and say that is a durational element. And don't use a unit because it's a non-numeric, and just say it's 5 years and 6 months or 48 months or whatever, however you want to express it. So this is one of those cases where the IFRS taxonomy is basically, it's got a much wider audience, and therefore is indeed in some conflict with, guidance in the EFM. But remember, the EFM is guiding you in how you tag and how you create your extension. It doesn't necessarily govern the underlying taxonomies. And we don't expect the IFRS to change here. And we also don't expect you to use a different element just because the quote unquote type is different, unquote. Go ahead and use the standard element, that's okay. There aren't very many of these things anyway. But when you do, be aware that you're basically violating a sort of a fundamental idea here in XBRL, which is that you're not trying to use different units of time are not really meant to be used with decimals. It's just not part of the original scheme of things. So you're going to be causing somebody problems when you do that. But that's the IFRS taxonomy. Use those few that are there. If you have to extend, follow the guidance and you use durational elements.
Okay, thanks, Walter. The third question on the slide is, can the same text block element be used to tag a table or an entire note? Or all the elements?
Well, this is interesting. The scope of the question is a little ambiguous. Do they mean in two different filings, could one be a table and the other be a note? Yeah, I actually think that could happen. If they mean, can it be used within a single filing? Well, no, obviously they are supposed to both be in the same context, what's called the common context, I forget what it's called, the main context of the entire report. So you obviously couldn't do that. Using a dimension to do that, it's the sort of idea that has been floated around and then kind of knocked down by anybody who's actually trying to consume the data. So the underlying point here is, in the US GAAP taxonomy, yes, indeed, things are specific to either a table or a note. Not exactly true in IFRS. And the only thing you should be aware of is that, once again, if you're going to use it for, if you got a choice between using an element for either the note as a whole or the table inside, well, obviously you're going to use it for the note as a whole. And if you need to create a custom element, create it for the table inside. That's what we did in the sample instance, exactly to make that point. As far as whether you have to use the same text block element only as tables or notes across different filings, well, nobody's ever going to be able to enforce that. So that'll never work. So it's not even, you don't even need to worry about that. You focus on what the disclosure text is requiring you to do. Focus on what you're actually disclosing in the note. Use the correct element and worry less about whether it's called a table or a text block than whether, in fact, you've got the right disclosure there.
Okay, thanks, Walter. So the next question is, we kind of answered this a little bit, but this is a little more detail. Is the IFRS taxonomy utilizes decimal data types for shear elements, tags reported as shears, and has no period types, which we've covered. So they're asking, the question really is, are these items intended to be extended for shear item types as well?
Well, yeah, I love these questions. There's sort of the, we're looking at edge cases or conflicts between, different principles at work here. But once again, what's the overriding principle? Don't create an element if you don't have to. That's kind of the overriding principle. And if you have the number of instruments in share pace, it's not really a problem that you have a decimal element with a per share or share unit. That's not actually a problem. It would be a problem if you went and created analogous elements just to have it be a share item type. That would sort of be a problem. But as far as missing data types, meaning many more extensions, well, once again, I think we covered that for duration item types, and I'm not sure that there are actually a whole lot more cases of that. So once again, this is the sort of thing which is very hard to do until you actually have some amount of data in hand as to just how common the problem really is, at which point you then ask, well, aren't these things that should be in the IFRS taxonomy, Are they common enough? Should they be in some other taxonomy, et cetera, et cetera? We actually rarely find, we basically, if you look at the US GAAP taxonomy, when we talk about adding new elements, it kind of has to be over quite a big threshold before it's really worth adding to the taxonomy. So if you're talking about 1 or 2 out of our 400 IFRS filers, or 800 or however many there are, probably that'll always be an extension. It just doesn't seem, it's not clear to me yet that that is actually a significant issue.
Okay, thanks. I think we can skip to the next slide, Michelle. I think we've kind of answered the second question that's on the table on the slide here then. So on slide 16, I've got a question about just in terms of following the naming conventions for table text blocks. Does this matter?
Yes, follow the EFM, which says to use a table text block when you're making a table, when you're creating the extension.
Okay, next question. Can we borrow, and when we talk about, and talk about another taxonomy being created here, but can we borrow the currency axes from the US GAAP taxonomy?
Well, this particular one you won't need to, but in general, no, you shouldn't be borrowing axes from the US GAAP taxonomy. If that's all you're doing. If you actually have got a US GAAP disclosure in some note of your IFRS statement or in some schedule required by the SEC, that's a totally different matter. But if it's just a question of, you want to avoid creating a currency axis in your namespace, don't worry about that. Just go ahead and create. And once again, I'm using currency axis as a stand-in here for other axes that you might do. That problem is a lot deeper than anything. Just the problem of proliferation of axes is not one which is specific to US GAAP or IFRS. It's a bigger issue. You're not going to solve that just by having some rule about do or do not use it from another taxonomy.
All right, thank you. The final question we've got here, which IFRS-based taxonomies will be accepted by the SEC, just 2017 or current plus prior year?
Well, I always really liked the 2013 taxonomy, so we were thinking of just going back to that one. No, actually, we can't tell you when the 2017 taxonomy will be available in Edgar, but it will. At the moment, it's just the 2016.
So we go to the next slide, please. If a table combines content from 2 separate table text blocks, is the best practice to extend a combined one or apply 2 separate text blocks to the same table?
Well, see, that's not a question specific to IFRS, so I'm allowed to do some Washington DC jujitsu on it and question the premise of the question or something like that. I actually don't know. It seems to me like you actually have maybe 2 different disclosures with the same text. In the case of the risk return taxonomy, that's actually reasonably common. So it's not really a problem to have the same text in 2 different facts. I know that we don't usually do that, but I actually would, if it were me, I would prefer to see 2 different text blocks.
Okay, great, thank you. The second question, I think we've already answered this. This is relative to the domain and the member. The third question is, as an FPI filer, is it okay to file using inline XBRL?
Yes, it is.
Good.
We think it's actually pretty cool. We're actually big fans of inline XBRL over here.
The final question on the slide is there are no DEI elements in the IFRS taxonomy. What's the best way to handle this?
Well, I'm glad they're not. You basically are just going to import the DEI taxonomy. If you look at the sample instance when that comes out, you'll see that you're handling it in exactly the same way that you do in US GAAP, which is it's a different namespace and different set of elements.
Okay, thank you. If we go to the next slide, please. This is an interesting question. I'm not sure I entirely understand what it means, but a file is required, and I'll give you a crack at Walter. A file is required to put XBRL producing software information like it's done in other jurisdictions. For instance, a company's house required to put business name production software and business production software. If yes, what taxonomy concept should be used to indicate the software provider?
It's an interesting idea. I didn't know that they actually did that in other jurisdictions. It is not an SEC disclosure requirement. We do like to see it in there as a comment, near the top of the page, on top of the file. But God help us if we ever try to mandate that. It doesn't make any sense to mandate a comment. You probably, if you've ever looked at a large number of XBRL filings, have seen that it's very often, and right down to the version, and it's in a comment, and that's nice, but you don't have to.
Thank you. Okay, next question is, so the SEC released FAQs on what disclosure groups from the US GAAP taxonomy that may be used in an IFRS filing. Can you provide guidance on how liberal or conservative the use of the US GAAP elements throughout the financial statements and note disclosure should be?
Well, it's hard to interpret liberal and conservative in this context. And dangerous to do so. But I think what they mean here is, for instance, like in the next question, they're saying, should you go search in US GAAP taxonomy for an element? No, you should not. And the reason is because you are not, if you're in the middle of a note, which is an IFRS statement, and you're disclosing something which is a IFRS concept like revenue or a monetary amount of some sort, you almost certainly are not actually disclosing the US GAAP equivalent, so don't use the element for that. The big exception to this, of course, is the one that we mentioned earlier, which is that there are SEC schedules that will henceforth be in a separate taxonomy that is not the US GAAP taxonomy, and that will apply equally for US GAAP and IFRS filers. And more news on that to come imminently.
Okay, thank you, Walter. The last question before we go to the CPE questions is just a question on validation, and someone here is using IRL software to validate, and they're asking, would IRL US SEC extended with IFRS be acceptable?
Well, obviously it depends on the exact version that you've downloaded, but if you went and got the latest version of IRL, that is using the latest version of the Edgar Taxonomy's XML file. And depending on whether you want to see a whole bunch of warnings about, LC3 names and so on, if you want to see that, that's strict. If you're not interested in all that and you just basically want to see, is this thing going to be accepted, then you would use pragmatic. So one of those two. And I believe there is something in there that's like SEC extended with IFRS, but I think that's a holdover from some project from a couple of years ago. That shouldn't be necessary, because you are, in fact, our Edgar Taxonomy's XML file now includes the IFRS taxonomy. So you don't really need that other one.
Okay, great. So thank you, Walter. Thank you, Jill. So for answering these questions, I think we can, I don't think we have time to go through the questions that we've been asked today. So I think, Michelle, if you want to handle doing the CPE questions.
Sure. Okay, we're going to go to our third CPE question. And hopefully you should see this on the screen right now. Which IFRS taxonomy release has been approved for use by the SEC? The 2016, the 2017 release, or both 2016 and 2017 releases? So just click on the response that seems most appropriate so that we can record your entry here. Okay, and I think we're going to end the polling now in just about 5 seconds and go to the next question.
Little barnyard noises there.
Sorry, the geese are heading south. Okay, our fourth question. When foreign private issuers begin filing an XBRL, do they have to submit the XBRL at the same time as the HTML or text submission? Okay, and your response choices are the XBRL and HTML must be submitted simultaneously. However, companies can take advantage of an optional 30-day grace period for their initial XBRL submission regardless of filing type. Response 2, the XBRL must be submitted within 30 days of the HTML. Or response 3, the XBRL must be submitted prior to the HTML filing. So again, click on the appropriate response and record your answer. And I believe there were a few people who may not have been able to see the polling questions 1 and 2. And we'll make sure we take care of those individuals. So if you could just email us if you, for some reason, you were not able to record your initial responses, just let us know. Okay, I think we're going to end the polling there. Thanks very much. And we did receive a number of questions that we weren't able to get to. But I think we've actually run out of time here. So hang on one sec. I just wanted to post on the screen the SEC reference links, which are included at the end of the presentation. And we have them for both SEC and also for IASB. We do plan on holding another webinar like this sometime this fall. So the timing has not yet been determined, but we will get back to you, and you'll hear more about that in the in the coming weeks. I want to thank all of our speakers today: Campbell Pride, Jill Davis, Walter Hampshire, very much for providing this to us. And we will be posting the replay for this event on our website probably by tomorrow. So if you're interested, you can forward that on to colleagues or listen to it again. And thanks again, and we hope to see you at our webinars going forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michelle.
Thanks,
Thank
Walter.
you, Michelle.
Thanks,
you, everybody.
Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.